Hello, everyone. So I know that you've been seeing like a mess load of articles about the coronavirus issues, all from death, the numbers, the constant bombarding of the different articles of the death toll, and you have the news on television. It's everywhere. I mean, the inequality we're starting to see. And speaking of inequality, this is about survival. And so this article came out about titled Survival, Tenants, Landlords Brace for the Largest Rent Strike in Decades. And so I know they have said to a lot of people who are either homeowners or renters, and this primarily is dealing with renters right now, that there's a moratorium on people's rents and mortgages, and that you have in certain states either 2 or 3 months, or some have said they may try to extend it for more. There's been different talks about how to deal with the rent and mortgage issues. And so a lot of tenants are on edge because they know that this moratorium, it only froze the rent. It didn't void the rent. In other words, it didn't forgive or do any type of forgiveness to exclude that the months that the pandemic and the shutdowns were going on. It just basically froze it so that you still owe the rent from the start of this pandemic to the end of the shutdown. Once they start opening things back up and people go back to work or start gradually getting out of their homes and going back to a bit of normalcy, you're expected as a tenant to pay the back rent. And that is the big hovering question that a lot of people have. The issues, before I even get into this article, is that some people did not get the stimulus for whatever reason, and the stimulus was only $1,200. That doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't cover the rents in some of these cities and metropolitan areas where the rent is $2,000 or more a month. And some people have different circumstances. They may be undocumented and they cannot qualify for certain assistance programs. Then there's people who, if they are citizens, they may not have had access to certain programs like unemployment insurance, and there are certain payment programs that they may not have been easily able to access. And we've heard that from a lot of small business owners, that they weren't able to access some things. Seemed as though a lot of the big companies, a lot of the banks got bailouts and they got help. But what about the smaller people that they deem the smaller people? People that live either borderline of the poverty level or below the poverty level, or they're working poor, or they work low wage jobs. They can't just have the luxury of working at home by computer. They're not high wage earners. A lot of people have been worried that there's going to be a tsunami of evictions. There's going to be, in other words, a lot of more homelessness, like we weren't already dealing with that before the pandemic, pre-pandemic issues of student loan debt, homelessness. A lot of things were happening before this crisis hit, on top of what we already were dealing with, which were viewed as crises. And a lot of it has to do with these cities that charge lots of rent, and there's a lot of inequality. So it says survival, tenants, landlords brace for the largest rent strike in decades. So I like to say, to start off, some of these names may not be easily to pronounce, but it says Kenia Alcocer is used to sitting down in the kitchen at the kitchen table to crunch her family's monthly budget and figure out how she can make the ends meet for the month. But this month is different. So Alcocer, who is 34 years of age, had just given birth in January to her second child, a boy named Gennaro, whose numerous health issues have added a huge financial strain on her family. And now with the coronavirus pandemic putting millions out of work, or millions of people out of work, and increasing financial anxiety across the country, she doesn't think that she'll be able to make the rent this month. So a lot of people have been met with the same issue. So I'm having to choose, in quotes, whether to pay the rent or pay the medical bills or pay other stuff like food and some of her incidentals. So she has said that in a phone interview. So I also have a 5-year-old as well, and my husband, he recently got laid off, and so these are the questions that everybody is having to ask themselves, and those are legitimate questions. So she added, rent is the last thing that I want to think about during this crisis, and being evicted is the last thing that I want to worry about. And so if you're not familiar with this person, most people should be by now, because we have seen, if you've been paying attention to what has been going on with the news segments on the New York City coronavirus issues. And, for me, I have, which I think by now everybody should have access to, where you can see all of the different news or media coverage from city to city, state to state. So Mayor de Blasio, he calls for a rent freeze and a halt on evictions. Now, this was in New York City. They've also done it in Los Angeles, and they've done it in some other places as well. And so some of the metropolis or the city-like or high rent places, like Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, maybe I believe you can throw in some others, just to name a few. So Alcocer is one of the tens of thousands across the country who will join the largest coordinated rent strikes in decades this Friday. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that will be tomorrow, affecting 3 of America's largest cities, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, and I would say there's some other cities in there as well. I've heard people complain that gentrification was taking hold even before this pandemic, and it was all over in these particular cities. And so it's already been issues of inequality before the pandemic, and so now it's pretty much showing itself in an ugly light. And so I'm adding that in there. But Alcocer, an organizer with the group's Union of Vecinos, which is the Union of Neighbors, which organized a rent strike in East LA this month, said that the largest Los Angeles tenants union is planning a city-wide rent strike. And so she predicted that it is going to be roughly about 8,000 union members that will forego the rent this month. Now, foregoing the rent, basically not paying the rent. And some people have no choice but to not pay the rent because they cannot do it financially because they have lost their jobs. So the tenants union had 3,000 members before the crisis. So by March, it grew by 1,000. And in mid-April, it doubled by 8,000. So she said the growth is taking on testament to the uncertain times that we're being presented today. So people are looking for something to join because they don't know what to do, she said. The reason why our campaign is called Food Not Rent is because we're actually telling folks to choose survival rather than just paying your rent and not having any food and not being able to survive. And, you're not able to wash your clothes, you're not able to pay for, your car and different things like that. There's other obligations you have as well, other than just the rent. So choose life over paying your rent at this point, basically. So Sia Weaver, another situation where the communication coordinator for the Housing Justice for All, a coalition of 70 groups, from across New York State representing tenants as well, homeless people, and the housing advocates. Estimated about 10,000 people have pledged to strike. So they're also doing it. They're doing it across the country in many cities who have had a long battle with the rent hikes, with inequality, with low wage earners having to pay a third of their monthly income just to cover the rent. And so what Weaver hopes to see is that, she said, an unprecedented government intervention, because they're intervening in the banks. They're intervening, always talking about the stock market. They're always talking about the businesses and how to save these businesses and how to save these companies. And it's usually the bigger companies. And haven't we not, if you haven't been watching, there have been small businesses that have been thrown to the wayside, and the bigger businesses seem to get millions and millions of dollars in loan or money funded to them so they can stay afloat through this pandemic and far beyond. Some of the universities have also partaken in that. And a lot of times they come back with a rebuttal to say as to why they're keeping their money. There's been a lot of criticism about some of these companies and larger businesses taking money that other small businesses and other people could be using that could help their situations, people that are in need. And the greatest need seems to be right now that we're about to face is low income artists, people that are working sun up, maybe sundown type jobs, having to work two jobs or maybe just that one job and not being able to really make ends meet. They're living paycheck to paycheck, and they've been constantly being bombarded by landlords to come up with the rent. And so now there's a freeze, but when that freeze is over, they're going to be expected to pay rent during the time that they lost their job and there was a pandemic. And so does that sound fair? It doesn't. So this is where we're at right now. So what Weaver hopes to see is that, she said, going back to this article, is an unprecedented government intervention. When is government going to step on in and see the problems that are happening in the small communities? It's not only just with people getting the virus and not being treated fairly and not being given the test, and after multiple times of asking to take the test, now when they finally get the test and find out they test positive for the virus, they die, and they weren't given the test because they didn't show the symptoms. And it's usually in the poorer communities. So we've seen that disparity. Now we're seeing the disparity having to do with the financial aspect of it. So in the housing market, because of the economic effects of the pandemic, and she wants this to be the chance to make the market more equitable. So we're in a moment where politically impossible things are possible, and a rent strike is not just about canceling rent for this crisis, but she said, citing at the pace at which Congress moved to pass a massive $2 trillion relief package and other pandemic-related aid. It's about like opening up a whole new world of social housing as well. And so what we've seen is that she added that we don't go back, and to go back to a world which this is what was happening before pre-pandemic, 92,000 homeless people on the streets of New York, New Yorkers that were homeless, Los Angeles, Seattle, Atlanta, Georgia, Detroit, so many different, Philadelphia, so many cities, San Francisco, with so much homelessness before this pandemic. And so what are we going to do about this? And half of our state can't afford to pay their rent. So Bob Pennegar, CEO of the National Apartment Association, which has 81,000 members nationwide, said April was a good month for apartment owners and many saw tenants use credit cards to pay rent in advance of an expected stimulus money. And what was that? We all know it was only $1,200. And so the rents for some of these places are like 2,000 or more or better, 3,000. Some you wouldn't even want to believe how much they are asking. And then they tack late fees on to the rent if you didn't make the rent the 1st or the 6th of the month. You get a late fee attached to it, so that increases your rent even more. But for May, he said, there's uncertainty in May because he said that the rent strike is counterproductive. So some people are against the rent strike. Here's why. Counterproductive because it would put more stress on the economy. There's definitely growing concern, he said, but everyone anticipates that there's going to be distress and it's going to be more pronounced than even April, because we're getting close to the point where they're going to start lifting things, opening things back up slowly and trying to restart the economy, and they're going to expect that rent. So Doug Beebe, president of National Multi-Family Housing Council, which represents the apartment industry, called the strike reckless. Okay, so that's his version of it, and here's why. Because the ripple effect on the housing market, he believes. More than 43 million households are renters, according to the organization. A wide enough strike that could be devastating, he said. So these people don't think through who they're hurting. They're disrupting the entire financial ecosystem in doing this, he said. And so they think that they're hurting the big bad landlord. And what they're really hurting are all kinds of people just like themselves, and they are spreading the economic malaise more broadly in the economy. And so he said that instead that there should be a more direct focus on pressing local federal lawmakers to intervene. And so he's saying that people should organize not to go just against not paying rent and to just refrain from paying rent, but they should go target the lawmakers to intervene, the federal lawmakers, that is, to try to interact. And so here's what they propose. He said that his group, for instance, has been pushing what is called a sweeping bill promoted by Representative Maxine Waters, who's a Democrat in California, by the way. And she's very active here in Los Angeles, which would provide $100 billion in direct relief to renters, as well as assistance for landlords as well, because when you don't pay the rent, then the landlords are not able to pay their rent. So it's, how would you say, a trickle-up effect? They always say trickle down. So, for instance, landlords and those experiencing homeless as well will both be taken care of equally. So housing advocates fear the mass evictions without government intervention. And so this is what the fear is, and this is the hovering question. It's who's going to intervene. So more than 30 states have moratoriums on evictions during the outbreak, but some will expire in the next month. So that is why this is being brought back up again, and it is a very serious deal because the virus is bad. But now we're seeing, if you're really paying attention, that they're coming up with some clinical trial vaccines. They've got scientists all over the globe trying to work on this. I believe, and I propose, and I'm saying this off the top of my head, they said 18 months, 2 years, as long as 2 years it could take to find an actual vaccine. But from what I've been seeing, I believe they'll have something before the end of this year, or by the end of this year, by fall. And because they have some great minds that are really working overtime, and they've already found some promising medications that are proposed medications that could really, really slow the spread of this thing and could probably be the catalyst that'll keep this thing, this virus at bay. But outside of the virus itself is the financial impact that this whole pandemic has caused on many cities. And so this is the thing that is the pressing question, is how are we going to solve, when the moratoriums and the rent freezes are over, the massive evictions and homelessness that could forego after all of this is over and done and said. Not only dealing with the inequality and all the deaths and all the things that have happened, but also the financial inequality as well. So more than 30 states have moratoriums on eviction during the outbreak, but some will expire in the next month. So other states like Colorado have no such mandate, which has left evictions to the courts. So some states are different. They don't have the same types of freezes or moratoriums. They've already started eviction processes, so people already are looking at going to shelters or living with family and friends or being homeless. So the local governments are creating a patchwork of policies and ever-changing guidance. So in New York City, the American Center of the Pandemic, Mayor Bill de Blasio, it was the epicenter of New York. We were seeing all the deaths. So Mayor Bill de Blasio is a Democrat, and we see him on the news. Some of us have watched it. We've seen him on the news, and he has called for the rent freeze and halted the evictions. And Governor Andrew Cuomo, who also is a Democrat, has signaled no willingness to cancel or freeze the rents. Okay. In other words, there's no canceling of the rent. It's just sitting there. You owe it. We're not going to expect you to pay it right now. But once we lift everything and people start gradually going back to work, you are on the hook. You owe the back money. And so that's what that is. And that is a problem for a lot of people. And it's going to be a problem. So in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, Democrat, barred evictions through the end of May. So he's extended a little bit more. So you're able to breathe a little bit. But once May is over, we're pretty much facing the same thing that New York and all the rest of the other big states and cities are facing. So tenants must notify landlords within 7 days of failing to pay and provide documentation providing that they were affected by the pandemic. In Arizona, which I think this was a great idea, and it shows that they're really caring about the residents of Arizona, they created a $5 million fund to assist those struggling paying their rent because of this outbreak. Why can't the other states do the same? Maybe there's a reason. Maybe they're more concerned about the big companies because that's more money to keep the rich rich. That's just my opinion. I'm throwing that in there because it all works out. Because when you're looking at the stock market and you're looking at all the different companies and how you have a share in them, you're looking at your money working for you. And so your money's not working for you if you're worried about renters, because you have your house and you have your life insurance policy and you have your good career and you have your shares and stocks and bonds and all of that, and you're just worried about your family and what's happening to you. But when it has to do with other people, that's not of a concern. People are far removed. So, but the advocates want more direct relief to the most in need, and usually it's people that are in these communities. We've been seeing it on TV. We've been seeing it. It's been all of the people who are the working class, working poor. So we were already fighting for an eviction moratorium before this crisis. They were fighting for this, and now we're seeing that was possible during this crisis, Alcocer said. So if banks are getting bailed out and corporations are getting bailed out, Why aren't poor people getting bailed out through this process as well? That's the big question. Basically, I'm foreseeing what I've already been reading. So she said that some of the members of her organization did not get stimulus checks from the CARES Act program because their immigration status, or they have been unable to access unemployment benefits, and others have had to choose to potentially expose themselves to the virus by continuing to work for fear of eviction, of course, I'm sure. So, New York State Senator Michael Generis, a Democrat, introduced the legislation calling for rent forgiveness, which is another effort to basically void the rent, which I say that would work in the best favor. But you have to also not only look at the renters, you have to look at the landlords as well. How is that going to help? So, as well as financial relief for landlords. So, this makes it a full spectrum. So, not only helping the renters, it also helps the landlords as well, is voiding all of it all together. So, first and foremost, we need to protect the renters and the tenants that are in desperate straits right now. And from that point forward, landlords who rely on that rent, they pay their bills, should be next up the ladder. And so, like I said, the trickle up effect. And so, he said in a news release announcing this bill, and so it sounds good to me, but will they act? Will they act on it? So the legislation calls for 90 days of rent forgiveness for residential and commercial tenants if they lost their work or businesses because of the pandemic, which is a legitimate crisis that has happened and has affected millions of people all over. So as well as the 90-day suspension of some of the mortgage payments as well. So he's going a step even further, even to the homeowners. And so you have homeowners that maybe they were working great jobs, but they might even have jobs they can't just sit at behind a computer and work, you know. So the federal government showed with some magic pot that paid people's rent for them and would solve the problem across the board, he said. But I'm not prepared to wait and hope that that happens. So do you think that'll happen? I don't know. We shall have to wait and see. But at some point, this is going to come up. And it's already coming up. Because in the meantime, people are already suffering. You have people who they're basically down to like not that much money, and they're just really paying for groceries to keep food on the table. And some people, that's all they had. All they had was their work, or their one job, or their two jobs, or three jobs, or however, or maybe the one person that's working in the family, And if you get sick, that makes it even more stressful, because a lot of people who work these low wage jobs and they make only ends meet, and they live paycheck to paycheck, you're trying to keep from getting sick, and then having this thing hovering over your head that you're putting yourself out there and you could potentially be sick. Then all the other issues of financial inequality come into play. Not having health insurance, having to try to pay for medicine that you can't afford, hospital stays, how much is that going to be? That's the only thing that people who are in poverty are thinking about. You don't even think about your own health. You do, but you don't, because you're so worried about not having the money to pay for it. That's all you're concerned about. What do you think? Now we're not only concerned about our health and all of the inequality that goes with it, but then now you're worried about how are you going to live, where are you going to live, where are you going to stay, are you going to be able to cover the rent, are they going to expect the rent from you? And lo and behold, people before the pandemic, if you already had an eviction, let's say you had problems paying your rent before because of just not being able to afford it, because there was high rents. Those were issues that were already going on before this pandemic. That just puts you in more financial crises. So having said that, I'm going to let this video go. It just seems like this is not going to be over. Right now, we're seeing on the news, they're expanding the testing all of a sudden. And what it seems to me, from what I've really observed, is that the testing was only for a select group of people, and they were concerned about that select group of people first. And it seemed to be the people who were higher at risk, or the people who had, like celebrities, people who had, been on these cruises, who might have had a little bit more money. And people who were having access to all these other medicines, they were able to afford it. They could somehow call somebody. They knew a friend that worked in ER, or they had connections. Now, after all the death and the mayhem and all of the news press coverage, and we're seeing the face of inequality through healthcare, which has always been hotly debated before the pandemic. Now we're seeing that they're expanding the tests because they have all these test kits for all these people down at the bottom who don't make that much money, basically. And so now they're proposing that they open up everything. And why? I'm going to tell you why. Because they've finally got some promising news of some vaccines. That's why. And so the same thing is going to happen, just like it did with the testing. The people who are going to have access to those vaccines first are going to be people who have health insurance, who have the money, and who have the connections. And then finally, once they make enough of the vaccine, it'll be widely distributed. It'll finally get down to the people that don't make that much money. That's how it always works out. To me, it seems unfair. I think it should get out to everybody, no matter what economic status that you're in. But this is the world we live in. And so, same thing with the rents and the financial crises that we're about to see happen, unless the federal government steps in and acts now.